I jolted upright, heart pounding so fiercely I thought my ribcage would crack. The phone in my hand buzzed against my palm as my eyes snapped open to the wreckage of my living room. Broken glass littered the floor from where a heavy bookend had fallen off the shelf. My ears rang with the echo of an earth-shaking rumble that had rattled the entire house just seconds ago. I felt my pulse throbbing as I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline surging through my veins. My tongue felt dry and I could hardly form words when I realized the noise that had nearly shattered my windows came from across the dusty old road. I took a shaky step toward the front door, feeling that something huge and terrifying was happening just outside. I could taste bitterness on my lips, the flavor of fear, and I had no clue what might greet me once I crossed that threshold. I flung open the front door and nearly stumbled over the welcome mat. The air smelled like diesel, chemicals, and dust. An enormous crane loomed across the way, accompanied by several bulldozers, each belching black smoke into the early morning sky. Workers wearing hard hats shouted at one another, their voices blaring through my confusion. My eyes darted around, and for an instant it felt as though I'd stepped into a battle zone. Bright hazard lights blinked in nauseating patterns, and the squeal of metal scraping metal sent jolts of panic deep into my gut. It was 5 in the morning, and I was standing on my porch, barefoot and disoriented, facing a construction site that seemed to have sprung from the underworld overnight. My stomach sank the moment I realized precisely where they were drilling. They were parked on what used to be my family's farmland. The wide acres of golden grass my grandfather had once proudly tended, now flattened by monstrous machinery with the letters HOA stamped on the side of every truck. Just a few days ago I had heard rumors that the Homeowners Association was planning something big, but I had never anticipated they would invade so soon. And I certainly never imagined it would look like this. Someone banged on my door, hard. Another shock to my system. I spun around, heart racing, only to see a stern-faced woman wearing a crisp blazer and holding a sheaf of documents. She was flanked by 2 men in suits who both towered over her. She didn't bother with a friendly greeting. Instead, she thrust a stapled packet toward my chest. Her voice was cool and rehearsed, like she'd done this 1,000 times. "We're here on behalf of the Housing Oversight Alliance," she began, tapping the papers so I wouldn't ignore them. "According to newly approved local ordinances, the farmland adjacent to your property has been rezoned for industrial use. The site will be used to construct multiple factory units that are vital for the economic growth of this region." She paused for effect. "This is your notice of compliance. You are to cease any personal claims on the property and allow the association to proceed without interference." My mouth went dry as my world seemed to spin in slow motion. The farmland wasn't just another patch of earth to me. It was the very heart of my upbringing, the place where I learned to ride a pony when I was 4, the place where I'd chased grasshoppers under the hot summer sun, the place where I first heard my grandfather recite stories about our family roots. Every memory I had of my father involved that land. And now these intruders were stamping their seal all over it like it was no more important than a vacant lot. Worse yet, the brand new local ordinance was suspiciously timed to coincide with the HOA's thirst for expansion. I had no doubt they had been planning this for months, if not years. My home, which sat right at the edge of that farmland, was likely the next target in their grand industrial scheme. I tried to speak, but my voice cracked. "You can't just barge in here and—" The woman cut me off with an icy glare. "We can and we have," she said, exhaling with practiced impatience. "This land is officially sanctioned for development. If you attempt to obstruct, we will be forced to take legal action. Perhaps you should speak with your own lawyer." Then, without allowing me a single question, she turned on her heel, her associates trailing behind like well-trained dogs, and made her way down my porch steps. Moments later, the roar of machinery kicked back into gear as the bulldozers continued their destructive feast. The entire scene, from the acrid smell to the furious pounding of my heart, felt surreal. This farmland belonged to my family. At least, that's what I'd always believed. A dull ache spread through my chest as I sank onto the porch swing, the old wood creaking beneath my weight. Every sense in my body was on high alert, but I also felt numb. as if someone had pulled a rug from under me and I was still mid-fall. I glanced at the documents in my hand, pages of legal jargon that might as well have been written in hieroglyphics for all I could decipher in that moment. Bold titles and official stamps told me this was the real deal. They were giving me a notice of compliance, strongly suggesting that if I tried to fight them, I'd be crushed under a mountain of lawsuits and corporate might. The HOA was no small entity here. Everyone knew they carried influence and deep pockets. Blood roared in my ears, and a wave of dizziness hit me. My life had just turned into a high-stakes clash in the blink of an eye. I'd never really been the type to back down, but right now the enemy seemed impossibly large. Factories, after all, were big business, and big business rarely lost in these small American towns. I thought about my father, who'd passed away 2 years ago. He had spent decades complaining about the HOA's expansions, how they always seemed to get special permits at suspiciously convenient times, how they valued profits over people. I could almost hear his gravelly voice in my head telling me to stand my ground, to never let them trample on our rights. But how was I supposed to do that when they had reams of official documents claiming the farmland was no longer ours? I stood up with renewed purpose, ignoring the shards of glass I still needed to clean. "There's no way I'm going to let them win this easily," I muttered to myself. My knees still quivered, but my resolve hardened. I needed to do something, anything that might give me a fighting chance. I wasn't even sure what that might be yet, but I couldn't let them tear down my grandfather's legacy without a fight. I had to find a path forward or I'd lose everything that mattered. I took a deep breath, scanned the horizon one more time, bulldozers still buzzing like giant locusts consuming the soil, and then walked back inside. 1,000 questions battered my mind. Could I find old property records? Was there some obscure legal technicality that could protect me? Did I even have enough money to hire an attorney to go toe-to-toe with the HOA's formidable legal team? Slamming the door shut, I decided I'd start by looking through my family's archival files in the attic. If there was one place that might hold secrets, it was up there, among boxes of yellowed papers and dusty photo albums. My father had mentioned an original deed once, an old piece of paper so archaic it might predate modern zoning laws. If I could locate it, maybe, just maybe, I'd stand a chance of claiming what was rightfully ours. Yet even as hope flickered inside me, a pressing dread clung to my every step. What if I found nothing? What if the bulldozers tore up the entire property before I could mount a defense? With my heart still hammering, I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and marched to the attic ladder. As I ascended, I tried to steel myself for what was to come. Down below, the mechanical roars continued unabated, each reverberation a cruel reminder that time was running out. I tugged on the attic's pull-down ladder, expecting the usual squeak, but it resisted, jammed by years of neglect. I pulled harder, feeling the rung give way with a jolt. Dust cascaded down onto my hair and face, making me cough. My flashlight beam danced across cobwebs that shimmered like ghostly veils in the corners of the high ceiling. The air was thick, stuffy, and laced with the scent of old newspapers. Despite the suffocating environment, I felt a tiny spike of determination. Attics always felt like portals to the past, and this one was no exception. Boxes and trunks lay scattered around, many of them bearing my grandfather's faded handwriting. I inched forward, each step stirring up more dust. Rummaging through box after box, I kept an eye out for any documents that mentioned the farm or property lines. My back ached from squatting, and my patience wore thin as I flipped through old receipts, canceled checks, letters from relatives I'd never met. Occasionally, I'd find an interesting snippet that gave me a glimpse into how my grandparents lived, but nothing directly referencing the original deed. The minutes ticked by, and with each passing second that rattling chorus of machinery outside grew louder, as though it was creeping closer to my house. Eventually I came upon a small wooden trunk with a rusted lock. The trunk itself looked ancient, the corners reinforced with old metal caps that had tarnished into a dull green color. The lock refused to budge at first, but a little perseverance and the help of a flathead screwdriver pried it open. Inside, I found meticulously folded linens, a couple of sepia-tone photographs, and hidden beneath a tattered cloth, a weathered envelope. My breath caught in my throat the moment I saw the words "Property Deed Carmichael Farm" scrawled on the envelope in my grandfather's bold penmanship. I felt a tremor in my hands as I carefully opened it, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The deed was written in archaic legal language so different from the documents I'd just been handed by the HOA. The date stamped on it was from the early 1900s. My eyes scanned for anything that might confirm that the farmland was irrevocably ours. Sure enough, about 3 paragraphs down, I discovered lines referencing ownership extending in perpetuity to all direct descendants of the Carmichael line, describing boundary coordinates that matched our farm's location. Even more shocking was a clause that stipulated any attempted seizure or rezoning without unanimous consent from the land's rightful owners would be null and void. My disbelief turned into elation. This was huge. If this document was still legally binding, I might have stumbled upon the perfect shield against the HOA's bulldozers. But I knew from popular cautionary tales that unearthing an old deed was only the first step. I needed confirmation that it still held legal weight. Modern laws, local zoning statutes, and unscrupulous HOA board members could try to brush this aside as an irrelevant antique if they had enough lobbying power. A wave of determination flooded me. I had to try anyway. This farmland was my heritage, and I was not about to stand back and let a soulless organization ravage it without a fight. The roar of an engine outside thundered louder than before, making the windows rattle. I nearly dropped the fragile deed from the shock. Dread coiled in my stomach again. I had to hurry. I couldn't let them reduce the land to a crater before I even had a chance to invoke the deed's legal power. Carefully tucking the envelope under my arm, I hurried downstairs and grabbed my phone, ignoring the glass on the floor and the swirling dust in the air. I had one attorney friend who might help me, though our relationship was mostly built on the fact we'd gone to high school together. His name was Jesse Davenport, a small-town lawyer with a decent reputation for defending underdogs against corporate bullies. I tapped his number, pacing my living room while the phone rang. After what felt like an eternity, he picked up. His voice was groggy, and I realized it was still very early. "Hello?" "Jess, it's me," I breathed into the phone. "Sorry for calling so early, but I've got an emergency. The HOA is bulldozing my grandfather's land right now, like literally right now. I found an old deed that might stop them. It's dated from over a century ago. I need to know if we can use it to shut this operation down." My words tumbled out in a frantic stream. It took Jesse a moment to respond. I could hear him shuffling out of bed, the rustling of sheets. "Calm down," he said finally, though he didn't sound calm himself. "You have a deed? An original deed from the early 1900s? That could be important. Listen, take pictures, scans if you can, and send them to me right away. I'll do some quick research and see what I can find. In the meantime, don't sign anything or let them intimidate you. We'll figure out if there's a legal angle to put a stop to this." "Thanks, Jess," I said, relief washing over me. "I owe you big time." My phone beeped, signaling the battery was low, a typical stroke of bad luck on a day that seemed determined to test my resolve. I quickly rummaged for my charger, hooking it up in the living room. Then, with trembling hands, I carefully laid the deed on the kitchen table and photographed each page, making sure every line of text was legible. My phone buzzed again, a text from Jesse telling me to email him everything I had. I did so within seconds. Outside, the clamoring grew. I couldn't just sit here while they tore everything apart. Clutching the deed's envelope, I marched onto my porch. Dust clouds swirled as a bulldozer flattened another stretch of crops, the sight looking more apocalyptic by the minute. A man in a neon vest and hard hat noticed me and waved, likely mistaking my presence for compliance. My stomach churned at the sight. I wanted to wave a giant red stop sign in front of them, but I knew how these things usually went. Without an official order or injunction, they wouldn't so much as slow down. Still, I had to try. I ventured closer, protective instincts flaring. "Stop!" I yelled, though my voice felt small against the roar of machinery. A couple of workers paused momentarily, clearly perplexed by my outburst, but soon resumed their tasks. A foreman, wearing an official-looking badge with the HOA's logo, stepped over with a look of mild annoyance. He was a tall, broad man with sun-weathered skin and a practiced sneer. "You're not supposed to be here," he declared over the noise. "Step back behind the safety perimeter, please." I lifted my chin and forced my voice to stay steady. "This is still my property, or at least it's supposed to be," I said, holding up the old deed, though it was hardly visible in the chaos. "You guys have no right to bulldoze it without due process." He raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "We have every legal right. The local council approved it, the HOA has the permits, and I'm under direct orders to proceed. If you don't want to get hurt, you best keep your distance." His dismissive tone cut deep, but I refused to show fear. My heart hammered, a mixture of fury and desperation. "I'm not going away. I've got proof this land has been in my family for generations. You can't just overwrite that with new ordinances." He shook his head. "I don't have time for this. If you keep causing trouble, we'll have to contact the authorities. I suggest you step aside, miss." For a moment the world swam in front of me and I felt a surge of helpless rage. I realized with a sinking heart that this foreman was just a cog in the system. My real battle was with the HOA bigwigs who had orchestrated this entire fiasco. I turned around, scanning for the woman who'd delivered the notice earlier, but she was nowhere to be seen. Without official legal backing, I'd be as effective as a whisper in a hurricane. So I retreated, angrily, but I retreated nonetheless, back to my front porch. The thunder of bulldozers resumed. I couldn't watch them destroy more of my grandfather's fields. Frustration and anger boiled inside me, threatening to erupt like a volcano, but I forced it down. I had to wait for Jesse's callback. My phone buzzed, jolting me out of the red haze of my rage. It was Jesse, sounding more awake now. "I managed to look up some references," he said, his voice urgent. "If this original deed is valid and was never superseded by another legal instrument, you might have a strong argument that the farmland can't be rezoned without your explicit consent. The key is proving that your family's ownership was never lawfully transferred or relinquished." "But the HOA claims they legally acquired the land," I pointed out, voice shaking. "They have these new documents, new zoning regulations that say otherwise." "Yes, but if that original deed was never nullified or replaced, and if it's recorded in the historical property registers, you could have a legitimate case," Jesse replied. "The biggest hurdle will be the local council's willingness to honor the old deed. HOAs can be powerful and local politicians sometimes side with them for economic reasons. But let me see if I can get an emergency hearing or something similar." "Thank you," I breathed, relief and tension swirling inside me in equal measure. "I can't let them keep leveling the farm. I just can't." "Hang in there," he said before hanging up with a promise to call back as soon as he had more information. Part of me feared the farmland would be reduced to rubble before any legal measure stopped them. I paced my porch, teeth clenched, my mind spinning scenarios of sabotage or public protest. Could I rally the neighbors? Could I get the media's attention? Desperate times called for desperate measures, and I was ready to do anything short of chaining myself to a bulldozer. The day wore on with excruciating slowness. The hammering, drilling, and revving of engines outside felt like physical blows each time. Dust coated my windows and made the inside of my house gloomier than usual. I downed multiple cups of coffee, each one doing little to quell the exhaustion and anxiety gnawing at my psyche. By midday, my phone finally rang again. It was Jesse, and his tone was cautious but hopeful. "I've reached out to a judge I know in the county," he said. "He's no fan of big corporate expansions trampling on small landowners' rights. If we can provide him with enough evidence, he might issue a temporary restraining order to halt construction. But you need to prepare everything: documents, testimonies, proof of lineage, that kind of thing. A surge of hope threatened to bring tears to my eyes. I can do that, I insisted. I have old photos, letters, genealogical records. I'll pull it all together. Good. Do it fast. Time is critical. He gave me instructions for how to compile everything. The hearing could be as soon as tomorrow if the judge was willing to push it. Just don't lose heart, he added softly. I know they look big and scary, but they're not invincible. After the call, I sprang into action, rummaging through the attic again for anything that proved the farm was consistently under my family's name. I found more letters, some referencing the property's acreage, and a family tree my father had put together. The deeper I dove, the more I felt my grandfather's presence, as if he were guiding me. Memories flashed of him telling me how his father had once fought unscrupulous land speculators. Always keep your head held high, Grandpa used to say, because if you don't stand up for what's yours, no one else will. His words fueled my resolve. I meticulously compiled documents, scanning them and printing extra copies. The day stretched into late afternoon, and I was so absorbed that I barely noticed how the bulldozer's roar seemed to lessen as the workers took breaks or shifted positions. By evening, I was running on nerves alone. The farmland outside looked unrecognizable in places, huge swaths of soil carved up into open pits. It was heartbreaking. My once idyllic view was dominated by a swirling haze of dust, diesel fumes, and the skeletal outlines of partially erected structures. However, that heartbreak fed into my determination. Every time I wanted to collapse in despair, I'd look at another old family photo, my father smiling as he held a newborn calf, my grandfather leaning on a wooden fence with a pipe in his mouth. And I'd keep going. Night fell. The construction noise finally subsided, though a few security lights and guards remained to prevent any meddling. Exhausted, I sank into the couch and half-dozed, the original deed clenched in my hands like a lifeline. I dreamt fitfully of losing everything, of giant factories towering over the graves of my ancestors, of corporate suits laughing at my futile attempts to defend my home. Then, just before sunrise, I woke with a start to my phone ringing again. It was Jesse, sounding triumphant. I got the judge to agree to a hearing first thing this morning. He's going to consider issuing a temporary restraining order. Grab your documents and meet me at the county courthouse in 2 hours. I practically leapt off the couch, heart hammering. After inhaling a quick cup of coffee, I gathered every piece of evidence I'd prepared, including the original deed and genealogical charts. Then I hopped into my old truck and drove as fast as I dared to the courthouse. The roads were empty, the sky still tinged with pre-dawn light. My stomach fluttered like a swarm of anxious butterflies. This hearing could be the difference between saving my family's farm and losing it forever. Parking outside the old stone courthouse, I took a moment to steady my nerves. You got this, I whispered to myself, gripping the binder of documents so tightly my knuckles turned white. I marched up the worn steps, the echo of my boots on the marble floors reminding me of every courtroom drama I'd ever seen. Jesse was waiting by the security checkpoint, tie askew but his eyes resolute. "Let's go," he said, giving me a firm nod. We made our way into the courtroom, which was smaller than I expected. The judge, a stern-looking man with silver hair, sat behind a massive wooden bench, flipping through a stack of papers. The atmosphere felt heavy, as though history itself were about to be made. The HOA's representatives were there too, a man and woman in impeccable suits, their expressions coldly smug. They set up thick binders on their table, presumably full of their own paperwork. My throat tightened at the sight of them. Beside them sat the woman who had shoved documents at me the day before. She glanced in my direction, lips curving into a slight smirk that made my blood boil. The judge called the session to order. Jesse presented the original deed first, carefully explaining its significance and historical context. He pointed out the clause specifying that the farmland belonged to my family in perpetuity. The judge's expression shifted subtly, indicating he recognized the potential weight of this evidence. Then Jesse introduced genealogical records, proving I was indeed a direct descendant. We even brought up how local developments must respect older property claims if no official transfer had ever been authorized. The HOA's council argued that the farmland had been legally rezoned by the local council, referencing various statutes about eminent domain and the best interests of the community. They claimed to have followed all necessary protocols, including notifying property owners, which to them meant posting some short notice in a newspaper or mailing something to an outdated address. My heart pounded as they tried to paint me as a disgruntled local who'd ignored all the official steps. I clenched my teeth but stayed silent, trusting Jesse to handle it. He did, pointing out inconsistencies in their timeline and highlighting that the farmland had never been sold or relinquished. The judge's gaze flickered from the HOA's attorneys to Jesse, then to me, as if weighing the fairness of it all. There was a tension in the air so thick I could almost taste it. Finally, after what felt like forever, the judge spoke. "I'm inclined to issue a temporary restraining order, pausing all construction until we can more thoroughly investigate the validity of this original deed. It appears there may be cause to believe that the farmland in question is still under the rightful ownership of the Carmichael family." His gravelly voice echoed in the silent courtroom, and I had to stifle the urge to cheer. The HOA's representatives frowned in unison, and the woman who'd given me the compliance notice shot daggers at me with her eyes. A wave of dizzying relief swept over me. The judge set a date for a more extensive hearing. Until then, the HOA had to halt all work on the land. I couldn't believe it. I'd actually bought us precious time. Jesse squeezed my shoulder reassuringly, and we left the courtroom with our heads high. Outside, I leaned against the columns, breathing in the crisp morning air. The sun was rising, casting golden rays that felt like a promise of hope. But the fight was far from over. This was just a temporary measure. The HOA would undoubtedly pour resources into challenging the old deed, possibly even pressuring local officials to override it. I knew enough about politics to realize we were up against a giant. Yet for the first time since the bulldozers had appeared, I felt genuine optimism that I could protect my family's legacy. We parted ways, Jesse heading back to his office to strategize our next steps. I drove home, mind spinning with thoughts of how best to prepare for the real legal battle. When I reached my house, a hush greeted me. No thunderous machinery, no bulldozers smashing the earth, just an uneasy quiet, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Stepping onto the porch, I glanced at the scarred fields, marred by deep trenches and random piles of debris. My emotions caught in my throat, sadness for what was already destroyed, but also relief that, for the moment, the further damage had been halted. Even so, the tension was far from resolved. My phone buzzed again, and to my surprise, it was a number I didn't recognize. I picked up, heart lurching, only to hear a voice that oozed artificial sweetness. "Hello, this is Barbara Hurst from the HOA. We'd like to extend a proposal to discuss an amicable resolution. Perhaps we could schedule a meeting to address mutual interests." The nerve of them. I gripped the phone so hard my hand shook. "An amicable resolution?" I repeated, voice tense. "You mean you want me to sign away the farmland so you can keep building your factories?" She laughed, a hollow, clipped sound. "I'm sure we can come to some arrangement beneficial to all parties, financially and otherwise. We wouldn't want this to become too costly for you in the long run. The hearing process can be dreadfully expensive and time-consuming." It was a thinly veiled threat. My chest tightened, fury mixing with the knowledge that many people would indeed be intimidated by the prospects of mounting legal fees. But I wasn't about to cave. "I have no interest in selling," I said firmly. "Well, let's not be hasty," she countered with a forced politeness. "Our attorneys believe the old deed might be disputable given modern statutes. We can save each other a lot of headaches by settling out of court." She pressed on, mentioning sums of money that would make some folks blink. But my mind flashed through all my memories on that farmland, playing hide-and-seek among bales of hay, helping Grandpa feed the goats at sunrise, planting seedlings under my father's careful instruction. No amount of money could replace that heritage. "I'm sorry," I said, voice shaking with anger, "but no deal." "Then I'm afraid we'll see each other in court," she replied icily, hanging up without another word. I let out a bitter laugh, the phone still in my hand. I felt the tension in my back muscles, the knot in my stomach. But I also felt a sense of clarity. I knew exactly what I was fighting for, and I wouldn't be bullied out of it. With a firm resolve, I locked the door behind me and headed to the farm's edge. I walked the perimeter, remembering every childhood footstep. The land was battered but not defeated, and neither was I. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal filings, public hearings, and community debates. I discovered to my surprise that a significant portion of the town's residents despised the HOA's push toward industrial expansion. Many felt the new factories would pollute the environment and ruin the rural charm of our region, damaging property values and the local ecosystem. While the HOA touted job creation and revenue, the truth was that most of the high-paying positions wouldn't be going to local folks. It was typical corporate spin, and people were starting to see through it. Some neighbors organized a small protest, marching around the construction site holding signs that read, "Save our heritage" and "Stop corporate greed." The TV news vans even rolled in one day, capturing footage and interviewing me about the historic deed fiasco. Standing in front of cameras made my nerves sing, but I realized how crucial it was to get the story out. Public opinion swayed local council members, and slowly, officials who once rubber-stamped the HOA's proposals began to reconsider their positions. The HOA, of course, fought back. They tried smear campaigns suggesting I was an obstructionist holding back economic progress. They claimed I was single-handedly preventing hundreds of new jobs. They hired more lawyers to dissect every paragraph of the original deed and question the authenticity of my genealogical evidence. But with Jesse's diligent efforts, plus the unstoppable force of public sentiment turning in our favor, the HOA's stance began to crack. They were used to winning easily, not battling a determined local with strong community support. One pivotal day, I was called to testify at a more formal court proceeding. The courtroom was packed with onlookers, from small-town journalists to curious residents. My hands were clammy, but I forced myself to speak clearly and passionately about the land's significance to my family and the community. I described how the farmland wasn't just dirt. It was a piece of living history that shaped who we were. I emphasized how the original deed was a testament to generations of stewardship, not merely a relic. I could see the HOA's lawyers looking uncomfortable. Their arguments about technical zoning regulations and economic benefits rang hollow against a heartfelt plea to preserve the land's legacy. By the time Jesse presented the final pieces of evidence, affidavits from long-standing neighbors, more genealogical documents, and an updated boundary survey matching the deed's coordinates, it felt as though we'd built a fortress of proof around the property's rightful status. The judge concluded the hearing by stating he would issue a formal ruling in a matter of days. Tension soared, but there was a bright spark of hope. The HOA representatives filed out, grim-faced and silent. It was clear they hadn't expected the community to rally behind me, nor for the old deed to stand up under scrutiny. I went home that night feeling cautiously optimistic, though still terrified that a last-minute political maneuver could undo everything. During those days of waiting, I hardly slept. I spent hours gazing out the window at the quiet farmland, battered as it was. The partially constructed shells of factory buildings loomed, a silent threat. I couldn't help but imagine the entire farmland paved over if we lost. I pictured the animals gone, the soil poisoned, my family's stories erased by a cold, unfeeling metal sprawl. That image was my worst nightmare. But then, on a crisp morning that smelled of early autumn, the final ruling arrived. Jesse called me at the crack of dawn, voice trembling with joy. "We won," he said simply, as if barely believing it himself. "The judge recognized the deed as valid. He's officially invalidated the rezoning on your farmland. The factories can't go up there without your explicit consent. It's over." We turned the tables. My entire body sagged in relief, tears pooling in my eyes. "Oh my God, Jess," I whispered. I can't believe it." He laughed, the sound full of triumph. "Believe it. You did it. You stood your ground." Even though I dreamed of this outcome, hearing it confirmed felt surreal. The farmland, my heritage, was safe from further encroachment. The partially built structures would have to be dismantled or at least left incomplete. The HOA was effectively cornered, their project on this land dead in the water. They'd probably appeal or shuffle funds elsewhere, but for now the farmland was ours, unassailable by their bulldozers. I thanked Jesse a dozen times, my gratitude overflowing. Stepping onto my porch in the pale morning light, I took a breath of fresh air. The fields, though scarred, still stood tall beneath the wide sky. I could almost sense Grandpa's spirit out there, giving me a proud nod. And despite the personal victory, I felt a deeper sense that this was about more than just me. It was about standing up to injustice, about preserving something precious for future generations, about refusing to let greed snuff out the heart of a community. By mid-morning, official notices were posted around the site, ordering construction to cease and contractors to remove their equipment. I watched from a distance as the bulldozers rumbled away, big beasts in retreat. The foreman from earlier stared at me with a look that was part disbelief and part grudging respect. The woman who'd first shoved the notice at me was nowhere to be seen. News of our victory spread across town. Neighbors who had once been distant offered congratulations. Strangers wrote letters and sent emails thanking me for defending the region's heritage and farmland. Even local media outlets covered the story of how one determined individual fought back and won against a powerful organization. Some folks even showed up asking to volunteer to help restore the damaged land. A local group started talking about turning part of the farm into a community garden or educational site. In the midst of all this, I found a renewed sense of belonging and purpose. For days I wandered the property, running my fingers through the loosened soil. I promised myself and the memory of my ancestors that I wouldn't let the farmland remain wounded. I'd rejuvenate it, plant new seeds, bring back livestock. I'd use the land in a way that honored my family's legacy, ensuring it remained a living testament to our history. The days of it lying dormant were over. It would flourish again. That first weekend after the ruling, I held a small gathering. A victory potluck, if you will. Friends, neighbors, and even a few supportive local officials came. Jesse stood by, looking proud and a bit sheepish at all the praise. Over grilled corn and homemade lemonade, we reminisced about simpler times, joked about the next battle we might face, and marveled at the wonders of community spirit. Under the warm glow of string lights we'd put up around the yard, we all toasted to defending what mattered most. In the following weeks, I met with environmental experts, local farmers, and even philanthropic organizations to discuss how best to restore the land. People reached out, offering seeds, tools, and expertise. A wave of generosity and enthusiasm seemed to ripple through the community, all sparked by the improbable victory. The farmland, once threatened, became a symbol of resilience and unity. Of course, the HOA didn't disappear. They sent a few letters hinting at the possibility of future negotiations, but they held no leverage now. They tried to salvage what they could of their project elsewhere, but around here their reputation had taken a serious hit, and with the original deed so clearly upheld in court, no one was too keen on testing that boundary again. For the foreseeable future, the farmland was safe. Standing at the edge of a newly tilled field, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. A few months ago, I was just living my life without any idea that a sudden thunder of bulldozers would flip my world upside down. Yet through the chaos, I discovered a fierce resolve I never knew I had, found allies in my neighbors, and reconnected with the spirit of my ancestors in a way that felt almost spiritual. I learned that there is power in the truth and in the community rallying around a just cause. The farmland was more than a patch of earth. It was a reason to fight, a place that taught me the importance of roots, history, and the responsibility we all share to protect what truly matters. Looking back on this roller coaster of a fight, I realize there's a profound lesson woven into every step of the journey. Sometimes, standing up for what you believe in requires facing a giant, a system so large it seems destined to crush you. But giants can stumble, and systems can be swayed when fueled by injustice and opposed by unwavering determination. Even when you feel alone, you might discover an entire community that shares your cause. And even when the odds look impossible, you can find a path forward by holding fast to your convictions and the truth. Above all, I've learned that land, heritage, and family are not commodities to be bought and sold for profit. They're living parts of who we are, shaping our values and our future. The farmland stands renewed, a testament to resilience and unity. It's a constant reminder that, when our principles are rooted in something deeper than material gain, no amount of bulldozers or corporate influence can erase our past, or our hope for the future. That, I suppose, is the moral I want to share with anyone who hears this story. Always fight for what's rightfully yours, not just in a legal sense, but in the sense of justice, honor, and respect for those who came before you. Never let intimidation or greed poison the foundation that supports you, because sometimes, when you hold on to what's right with all your heart, you don't just preserve the land, you preserve a piece of your soul. And you pass that legacy of courage and integrity forward to generations yet to come.